US Secretary of Defense Robert Gates has questioned the ability of NATO to have a global reach and sparked a debate about the relevance of NATO, or rather its irrelevance as a military alliance. This was echoed by Secretary General of NATO Rasmussen, who said that European nations have to step up to the plate and employ more resources and part of their GDP and raise it to 2% of their GDP to keep NATO going. But this begs the question about whether Europe is spending enough and whether the United States is spending too much, and whether NATO can be a transatlantic alliance as part of the transatlantic civilization of the West, the Western world being America, Canada, Europe in general, and also Australia and New Zealand, which have links to the Anglo-Saxon homeland of England and to the United States, the preeminent Anglo-Saxon power, and also the Western countries, the Western civilization, the Boers who have links to Holland and Germany. Well, Europe is currently engaged in several wars, which is winning, but perhaps only just through direct military intervention. Where it is winning on the ground is through alliances with people such as the Libyan rebels, who have now been recognised by the German government as the legitimate government of Libya, and the getting people to come over to our side, as they did with the Arab awakening and the Arab Spring in Iraq, and the Arab Spring later on. Such as the Sons of Iraq, who were former Sunni fighters fighting for Al Qaeda, who switched sides to the Americans by winning hearts and minds, as General Petraeus did in Iraq, and also less successfully in Afghanistan by disarmament to work programs, which are trying to get the Taliban to lay down their arms and come over to the side of NATO and the US in Afghanistan, with some varying degrees of success, because of course the Taliban are in fact taxing US contractors and the military for staying in their areas indirectly by the US offering these work to disarm programs. Seems quite illogical, but maybe it will work in the long run. Well, here it comes to the stark choice between spending on military or the economy, which Robert Gates set out. But we also have a stark choice between how we fight wars. The Europeans have chose a soft power approach to war fighting, which at the moment seems quite successful. Put it this way, the European Union, even with 6 million men under arms, which some military analysts say is a bloated military force, which is perhaps ineffective because it cannot even project a division across into overseas territory, couldn't have taken over the whole of the Arab world by a direct military intervention as the US did in Iraq. Even the US found a direct military intervention in Iraq extremely difficult. Despite the fact that they took over the country in 4 years, it took them nearly 8 years to subdue the country and get a government that was friendly to the United States in and keep the country together as a contiguous multi-ethnic country. Iraq could have, and probably the Israelis would have liked to see it, and maybe even some of the Europeans, be split up into 3 countries which were homogeneous: the Kurds, Sunni Arabs, and the Shia, and also maybe even the Marsh Arabs. So you could have had 4 different countries. That was definitely an Israeli plan before the Iraq War. But here Gates is arguing for the hard power strategy of NATO, and is this feasible? Will be the question of the second part of this vid. what the United States has is a industrial military complex which is based on the petrodollar and the expansion of the money supply from the Federal Reserve, and those flows go in a circular flow in a Keynesian model. And each district of the congressional districts and senatorial districts in the United States which make up the United States wants military contractors and military firms to be there, because not only does it fly the flag for the United States, it also means that they have a dedicated contributor to their campaign funding. So you can see the melding of politics and the military industrial complex together. Whereas Europe and the United Kingdom is much more different. The university systems are far stronger in Europe and the United Kingdom, and the industrial complex, so to speak, is more civil. Why can they do this? Because of the legacy of the Marshall Plan, which was created by the United Kingdom and United States after the Second World War, which was to rebuild Europe as a civil country. But this had another backdrop to the Morgenthau Plan, which was to deindustrialise Europe and turn Germany particularly, keep the Germans down particularly, into an agrarian economy. This failed, and that's why the Germans fought so hard to not be conquered by the British and the Russians and the Americans during the war. But another interesting point that the Germans during the 30s and 40s, both National Socialist and Social Democratic did, was military Keynesianism. What is military Keynesianism? That is the building up of your military by having deficits or near deficits for an expansion of your money supply. Now, the Nazis developed fiat, not only fiat currency, but fiat bonds to do this. And if you've seen my video Nazi Economics, you will see Third Reich Economics. I'll give a critique of this policy, which eventually did cause the destruction of the Nazi economy, and they did too much military Keynesianism. But I would argue that military Keynesianism is not an immoral thing, as you might be thinking it would be, because the Nazis used it. But it is a method of expanding your military very, very quickly when you need to. And the United States has perhaps had too much military Keynesianism, while the European Union hasn't had enough. But the European Union has been able to beat and conquer its rivals in the Islamic world by creating alliances with democratic forces within those countries. So therefore you see the Cold War warrior Robert Gates using his strategy of hard power versus Herman Van Rompuy and the European powers, particularly Angela Merkel and David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy, using some targeted hard power but mostly soft power and incentives for people to come over. So they're using more the carrot rather than the stick, which the Americans want to use. The Americans are always favoured to use the gun because they have a gun. And every problem does look like a nail when all you have is a hammer. The Europeans have a whole toolkit worth of different diplomatic, military and economic options to use against their enemies or to support their allies. But we do need more military Keynesianism, and we definitely need to be spending at least 2% if the Europeans are going to become a hyperpower, and we also a military hyperpower as well as the preeminent economic hyperpower. And we need to bring the European armed forces together quite rapidly, because we will now have an unstable region which we will need to develop into a Middle Eastern Union after the Arab Spring. Not every reason within every country in the Arab Spring is the same for its uprising. In Tunisia it was different, in Egypt it was different, but the whole swathe of it has one similar cohesive strand, and that is a move against totalitarianism, as we've seen in Syria.